I know you're sick of hearing from me by now, but we're not even halfway through the conference, so you're going to have to suffer through. No, I'm actually going to allow a lot of other people now to do the talking. So welcome, all of you, and thanks so much to the Oil City Civic Center, as it's known now, formerly the National Transit Building, still is known as the National Transit Building, the headquarters for the former Standard Oil in the Pennsylvania oil regions. And there are a lot of people in this room that know a lot more about this than I do, including the man I'm about to introduce. And so last year, we were very fortunate to have Bob McNally from Rapidan Energy, a former White House official dealing with energy. I'll let him explain that a little bit. I'll probably weave it into his presentation. But Bob isn't just a government crony. He actually writes, and writes well. His book, Crude Volatility, is very much in the theme of this conference. It's about the past, and he culled the data for the early part of the energy industry and recorded the volatility that we had here from the Derrick and other sources. He did it by hand, or at least with a lot of support, because a lot of this was not chronicled. And he made a very strong argument that the volatility of the early oil industry, which we suffered from here, and we suffered because it was boom and bust, right? When it was good, it was good. When it was bad, it was bad, right? It is in a way returning, right? And so as much as this is about the past, it's also about what it talks about the future, right? And that's what this conference is all about, right? And how do you navigate that? So I've given Bob a task. This is the great room. Right, and this was the office, I believe, and people can correct me, I think we believe this was the office of Joseph Seep, who was the major oil purchaser for John Rockefeller in the oil regions. Okay, now they were in different parts of this building and so on. So in this great room, we now, with a lot of improvements, it was really dusty and actually not very nice a few years ago. Now it's really been improved, and we're so happy that we're going to be hearing about that in a little bit. But the really true story about this building is that it was almost torn down and made way for a CVS drive-through. You're laughing, but wouldn't that be horrible, right? Think about if that would happen. That's all we need is another CVS and I've asked Bob to come here to not so much talk about the nitty-gritty details of the history that we know here, but to talk about the historical significance of this block and setting energy prices, not just on a national level, but a global level. So now I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hand this book over to Bob. These books are for sale through Friends of Drake Well outside, and Bob will sign them as well, so we can make that available. And I'm going to hand it over to Bob now for the next series of talks. So here you go. Bob, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much, Andrew. Before I begin, and I know we're not even halfway through, but I would like to ask everyone to join me in a round of applause for Andrew and his colleagues for putting on such a fantastic conference. Oh my God. It's just tremendous. You know, let me start by sharing that history is really my passion. Growing up, I wanted to be a history teacher, particularly military history. Didn't even do well in math, certainly not interested in economics of any kind, much less commodity analysis. Didn't get rich in the Peace Corps, however, and so in grad school I needed a job, and I was tapped on the shoulder and asked if I would like to count barrels of gasoline, and I said, if it pays money, I will count whatever you want. And after I graduated, I looked at the pay scales for history teachers, pay scales for oil analysts, and I went into energy. But with the exception of the Peace Corps and the White House for 5 years of my life, most of my career has been as an analyst. I've been in Washington, but I try to figure out how things work, how markets work. And my particular joy with crude volatility was I got to delve into my love of history, trying to ask the question, how can oil prices go from $30 a barrel to almost $150 a barrel, which they did 20 years ago, without a war in the Middle East? When do oil prices ever spike without a war in the Middle East? In modern times, the answer is they don't. We need an explanation. And to do that, I had to do the research. You know, a lot of people think that when you start, it's like, oh, we're going to talk about the history of the oil market. Well, we're going to start with the Arab oil embargo of 1973, because we all know nothing could have possibly happened before the Arab oil embargo in 1973 that's remotely relevant for today and what we're seeing in oil prices, right? That's wrong. To understand the roller coaster we've been on, you have to go before 1973 and you have to come right here. Now with history, I have a little quirk. I love places, like historical places, like spots. I'm obsessed about them a little bit. When I go to Israel, I like to go to the bottom of the town and the cliffs there, and there's the Gihon Spring. There's a freshwater spring. For 4,000 years, fresh water is coming out of this escarpment. It may explain why three main religions today, and God knows how many others, chose that area as a holy space, right? And it's like you're standing there and there's water bubbling out of the ground, and there aren't even other tourists there. Or you can go to Gettysburg and Little Round Top and ask yourself, if 500, 600 guys if the battle had gone a little different right here, maybe our country would have been different. Now, I live in North Carolina now, to get closer to our point, and in Southern Pines, about an hour south of Raleigh. A few miles away from me is a town called Carthage. Carthage used to be the buggy capital of, I think the whole East Coast. And they still have the old buggy factory. It's actually a struggling building. I hope they don't turn it into a CVS. But if you think about it, that space, if you think about it, for 5,000 years, from Moses to Harriet Tubman, the fastest a human being could travel on land, don't give me bicycles, okay, was a horse or a four-legged animal in whatever region you were living in, camel, whatever. And that all changed. And we had an end of 5,000 years of personal transportation a few miles from, 20 miles from my house. And we are standing in this place, which is associated with, oil wasn't about transportation in the beginning, it was about illumination, but is really now certainly connected to that huge transformation in transportation. And so I get tingly. Now you say, well, we're going to go to Oil City and Titusville, the oil regions, and we're going to see a historic space. And what do you think? Well, we're going to go to the Drake Well. Absolutely, can't wait tomorrow. No question that August 1859, that well, now I know we have a gentleman from Baku, and I know there's some controversy about who started the oil market, and there's a Canadian, I think, says it, I know that, but let's face it, what happened here launched the U.S. oil business, and that launched the global oil business, okay? And when we go to Drake Well tomorrow, and we sit there and look at it, you can see the actual drilling, the rotary rig that was used, you kind of say, gosh, this is where it all began. And I think, though, where we're standing right now is as important. And to explain why it's as important, let me start with this morning. This morning, I was not in attendance. I missed the sessions, and I feel sorry for that. I wasn't here because one of the reasons is I had to do an NPR Marketplace interview. You may say, but he's bragging. Believe me, as my wife knows, and as Michael Ratner and Philip Brown, who know me a long time, know, I am nothing special, so I'm not saying this to brag. But I was called up last minute, NPR, they're like, there's an OPEC report today, and demand is slowing, and we talked about it, and at the end the reporter said, why is this even important? Why should an average American care about this silly OPEC report? And my answer was, because it's about the price of the lifeblood of modern civilization, right? With power, you've got different fuels. With transportation, with all due respect to alcohol and electricity, it's still all about oil. It's the most important commodity in the world. You say, what about food? We couldn't grow the food without the oil. Now, it's had a rough couple decades here. I have a feeling it's going to come back in favor. But the reason we care about what an OPEC report or who's right about marginal demand growth and this and that is about the price of oil. And so my book is about oil price stability, and I want to talk about that. Price stability. Now, when the well was struck, it launched the oil business, but it also unleashed chaos. And that's in my book, it's in the historical books that are in the other room, any history of the oil market. There was absolute pandemonium. We'll see pictures of the rigs and so forth, the boom and bust price cycles. And one of the hardest things to determine was what the price was. Well, which would the price of oil be? At first, it was determined by the guy on the saddle in a horse who would pull up to a lady's farm and say, I'll pay you 17 cents for 6 barrels of your stuff. That's great, but who else knows that? How else are you going to find out what the price is? Down the road or something like that? You can't. Then it went to the curb of these streets. They would sit out here and start, talking a little bit and exchanging ideas. What'd you pay? I paid this, you paid that. And then it went to a train, I guess we're going to ride tomorrow, where they would have almost a rolling exchange, and it became better and better. But it was still immature. It was still too raw, too clunky to allow the business to mature. You didn't have price signals that producers and consumers could rely on. And this was chaos. It was chaotic. And it's a good thing back then the government could care less about oil. That started in the 1910s, 1920s, when oil transitioned from illumination to transportation. But man, was it vexing for John D. Rockefeller, and for everybody, really. So what you had is a natural movement to determine a price. And it sounds so simple. We think of price, you go to the store, there's a sticker, a price. Well, back then, it was critical to establish a price that could be relied on, that was formed by a liquid market of buyers and sellers, transparent, no shenanigans going on, rules, and that's what was set up here. Now, there were other exchanges in Titusville and other towns before here, but the oil exchange in Oil City became the biggest. It became the benchmark setter of oil prices for the United States and then the world, and we'll talk about that in a second. It was actually the third largest exchange of any kind in the United States after New York and San Francisco. It was a big deal. And it was here where they would trade these certificates, right? Because eventually what happened is the driller would take the oil to a pipeline or a pipeline depot, put it in the pipeline, put it in a storage tank, and get a piece of paper saying, you delivered whatever, 400 barrels of oil, 600 barrels of oil. And those certificates would trade as sort of like the modern, or sort of precursor to futures contracts that we have. And those traded exchanges became more liquid, more people came up, more volume was being done. Then you would have oil elsewhere would be priced as a differential to Oil City. So you could say, well, if I'm in Clarion County so far away and the transportation costs, what should the cost over there be? Well, it should be Oil City plus or minus something. And so the modern system of oil pricing was developed right here, and that enabled the industry to flourish. Rockefeller was right. With the chaos we had, it's not clear the industry could have really expanded, or at least as fast as it did, and take out turpentine and whale oil, which were then being used as illuminants. So now, the exchange here helped stabilize the price, helped establish a price. But oil prices are still naturally prone to wild volatility. That's the theme of my book. Oil itself as a commodity is prone to wild price volatility. Economists would say it exemplifies what's called extreme price inelasticity of supply and demand in the short run. What does that mean? Think about demand for oil. And compare it to chicken. If the price of chicken goes really high and you're hungry, you can buy beef, you can buy vegetables, you can buy something else. You can substitute something else for that chicken. If the price of oil goes really high, are you going to quit your job and say, I'm not going to go to the gas station today. I won't do it at this price. You're not going to do that. You're going to pay the price for gasoline. Now, you may go to Chipotle less, you may not, but you're going to pay that. Your demand for gasoline is not going to change depending on the price. Think if it goes down. What would happen if we had 50% off on Cabernets at the local wine store? I don't know about you, I'd be out of here filling my truck with Cabernet. My demand would go up right away. Now think about it. What if the price of gasoline were to fall to 75 cents tomorrow? Are you going to get in your car and say, you know what, I'm going to go to Pittsburgh and back because this is just awesome. I'm just going to... No. So demand doesn't... No, hold on to that idea. Demand doesn't adjust the price. Same thing on the supply side. It was a little different here in the oil regions because these were such prolific wells. All you had to do was stick your, the drill in the ground. You got it out. So it was a bit different here. You had oil supply responding quickly to price. But as we matured, the big oil fields takes years to bring those things on. Even the shale is not really responsive to price. I don't want to get political, but President Trump talks about unleashing U.S. energy production. I mean, to be honest, we're already unleashed in the short term. We just don't have a lot of extra spare production capacity. If the price of oil went to $120 tomorrow, it's not like the Permian drillers are going to turn it on and more oil is going to come out of the ground. OPEC has those. Okay, so inelastic, not responsive, the price goes like this. Now the first 50 years, it was really bedeviling Rockefeller, and he gets together here in the transit building, and he got offices in the exchange, and at least the exchange was an improvement. But for him, it was still too volatile, even with the improvement that the exchange brought us with that. And so eventually, with Joseph Seep, maybe from this room, they began to try to control the instability of oil prices by influencing supply. Now, Rockefeller did this indirectly. At first, he came to Pennsylvania. He thought about trying to buy all the farms and the wells and do it. And he looked at it all, and he's like, there's no way I'm controlling wellhead production. This is nuts. Private property, rule of capture, people coming in. There's like forests or rigs. No. So what he did is he monopolized what we call midstream now, pipelines, railroads, and refining, the consumers of the crude oil. And he imposed stability indirectly on the drillers from this building and eventually took over that building. He basically ran the exchange out of business. And he said, you know what, even with the exchange, it's too volatile, so we're going to start determining what the price is. Now, he wasn't like a Soviet price setter, like, it will be $1 because I wanted to, no. He had to be smart. There was always the free market, and it was always competitive. He was the dominant buyer, but it was always competitive. So what he had to do, and stay with me on this because it matters for where we are today and where we're going, and I hope we'll have great questions and discussion on this. What he had to do is figure out the price that was a good equilibrium, that didn't get too much production, because too much production, the price goes down and it wipes out investment. Didn't want that. So he couldn't have it too high, couldn't have it too low either. Get too low, then there's too high of demand and sufficient investment, and you get a boom in prices, and then that leads to a bust. You want to stop that space mountain. You want, it's a small world. His obsession was getting stability to price, and he succeeded. Even Ida Tarbell, his nemesis, whose father was put out of business by Rockefeller, and when she was castigating him, even she said he did a good job at stabilizing the price, actually. He did a good job at that. He was mean and nefarious in other ways. So he brings us that price stability. Now, Standard Oil, 1911, Standard Oil, we break up Standard Oil in 1911, right? What happened then was the return from the 1910s to 1930s of boom-bust oil prices. And this was terrifying to everybody. And now the government, because now oil is a strategic commodity. Oil replaced coal and ships. Oil won World War I. And all the things we're familiar with today started after World War I. FTC investigations when prices went up, et cetera, et cetera. And in response to the boom of oil prices in the 1920s, we had a bust in the late 20s and early 30s. And then that led to something, and this is where, to talk about this, you really have to talk about, one of the subjects you should never discuss in polite company, religion. Because, I grew up believing that, and working for a Texan president, many clients in Texas, I just assumed that God put Texans on earth to produce oil and limit government because they do that very well. So do Oklahomans. So imagine my surprise in my research for my book when I see, in response to the price collapse, pennies on the barrel, and this is now Texas and Louisiana are the big oil regions, Texans resorted to armed force to prod drillers away from their wells and impose the most severe quotas known to man. 3 guys would get together every month in Austin, Texas, and put quotas. It's not like OPEC nationwide, everybody cheats. No, they go through well by well by well. For 4 decades, Mao Zedong would have blushed at the heavy-handed overregulation of the private sector that Texans were promising. Why? And hold on to this idea. To banish price volatility. So, Texans inaugurated a direct form of supply control. They're like, this is so bad. In the case of oil, we have to forget everything we know about the private sector, and we have to have government regulation. And they did. And so for 4 decades, oil prices were as smooth and calm as a cool mountain lake. OPEC takes over from, they studied at the feet, literally. The founder of OPEC was this Venezuelan guy who was in exile in the 1950s, and he's like, this is amazing. 3 guys in Austin get together, do some supply, demand, cross the do, dot the T, and then they put a quota in. And if you don't do it, they put you in jail. But they keep oil prices stable. He becomes a revolution, he goes back, he's energy minister, he goes to Saudi Arabia. It's like, you've got to see this. They go down to Austin, Texas. They hire a guy from the TRC. Show us this. how you do this. So OPEC takes over. So from the 1932 until I would say about 2008, anyone alive or thinking about energy realized there's somebody out there, some force controlling whose job it was, sort of like the fire department or the central bank, whose job it was to keep the price of oil stable, because we can't have wild volatility for the lifeblood of modern civilization. And they did so. So OPEC takes over from the Texas Railroad Commission. They did about okay job. I measure their volatility. If you look back in historical terms, Rockefeller and OPEC were about as successful, equally successful, and